All right, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Sarah Walker, the Walden Woods Project's Education Director. Thank you so much for joining us for Now Comes Good Sailing, a virtual conversation. For those that do not know us, the Walden Woods Project is a nonprofit based out of Lincoln, Massachusetts. We preserve the land, literature, and legacy of Henry David Thoreau to foster an ethic of environmental stewardship and social responsibility. Our organization was founded in 1990 by recording artist Don Henley, and this past April, we celebrated our 31st anniversary. This is a Zoom webinar tonight, so you are only able to see the hosts and the panelists. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen if you're having tech difficulties, and I'll do my best to help you out. You can also use the chat to correspond with each other. I see a bunch of people saying hello. Good to see that. There will be an audience Q&A during the last 20 or so minutes of the event. Please enter any questions throughout in the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen, and we will get to them later. And if you would like closed captioning, you can click the live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And tonight we are joined by the editor and contributors of Now Comes Good Sailing, a collection of original essays exploring how Thoreau has influenced and inspired them, and why he matters more than ever in an age of climate, racial, and technological reckoning. Andrew Blonner is a literary agent and the editor of 7 previous anthologies, including Coach. 25 writers reflect on people who made a difference, and in their lives, great writers on great Beatles songs. Zoe Pollak is a doctoral candidate in English and comparative literature at Columbia University. Her writing has appeared in Agni and Women's Studies and is forthcoming in the Hopkins Review and Sonnets from the American, an anthology of poems and essays. Michelle Nijhuis is a project editor for The Atlantic and a longtime contributing editor for High Country News. She is also the author of Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction. Mona Simpson is the author of 6 novels, including award-winning Anywhere But Here. Her other works include The Lost Father, A Regular Guy, and My Hollywood. And the conversation will be moderated by Jeffrey Cramer, our curator of collections and resident Thoreau scholar. Jeff's works include I to Myself, an annotated selection from the Journal of Henry D. Thoreau, The Portable Thoreau, Solid Seasons, The Friendship of Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, among others. And welcome panelists and attendees. And with that, I will let you take it from here, Jeff.
Thank you, Sarah. First, it's great to be here talking to you all for having a conversation about this wonderful book with such diverse approaches to Thoreau. So it's a really exciting project to be connected to in any way. And I'm going to start off with a question for Andrew. And I know, Andrew, you and I had spoken about your project way in the beginning of it, quite a while ago. And what you wrote to me at that time was that from time to time, as pet projects, labors of love, I assembled collections on themes and topics that are typically near and dear to me. My next and likely last is on the subject of Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau has never been more relevant and resonant, insightful and inspiring and important than he is now. So I guess my question first is why he is so important now, or why do you feel he's so important now? But also, if this is to be your last, and I'm not sure that it still is planning to be your last, but if it were to be, why would this be a fitting capstone to all of your editing projects?
Thank you for all of that, Jeffrey, and thank you, Sarah Walker. Thank you to everybody at the Walden Woods Project. I especially want to thank Princeton University Press, the publisher of the book, all of the contributors, especially the ones that were here, and the audience out there spending part of your Tuesday night with us. It was interesting to hear that email to you, Jeff, quoted back. Is that I don't know if you have that date stamped, but I'm guessing it was. Well, I know it was sometime soon after the pandemic. I don't know when we were starting to call it COVID, or it was a project that I had been harboring for a long time and just dwelling in just profound procrastination, as probably a lot of people out there are nodding with recognition about sort of you just can't get that catalytic event or moment. And for me, it was COVID, because it very quickly, very intensely narrowed my focus. And I just couldn't bring myself to work on anything that didn't sort of feel like it had a heart and had a soul. And so it was sort of the kick in the back that I needed to sort of push it over the edge. And you were one of the first people I wrote to. I have one of your books right here, which I'm reading right now. So that sort of play on words, the timely and timeless and resonant and important. I always thought Thoreau was important, and I always thought it was timely. But there's a great writer named Pagan Kennedy, a Boston-based writer, who in the midst of all this said, "We're all Thoreau now." And that really resonated very strongly. And it was just something, it was akin in a way, and I'll stop after this, to after the Boston Marathon bombings. I'm a New Yorker. I'm in New York, in the middle of New York right now, but my heart and soul have always been in New England and Boston area. And after the marathon bombings, I sort of summoned something I didn't even know was there, a connection to the area and the people and the ethos. And I wanted to do something to help. And what can one person do? One of the things I do is put together these books. And so in that case, I put together a book called Our Boston, which came out 6 months after the marathon bombing. In this case, this project took about 18 months to go from sort of the germ of the idea, at least the proposal, to when it was published last month. So I don't even think I answered your question especially, but that's just sort of and the first piece of the puzzle, what I'll say, this is a self-selected, very highly educated group out there who probably know this. The title of the book, I don't think it's been mentioned yet, the explanation of it, "Now Comes Good Sailing," is the last known full sentence that Thoreau was known to have spoken before he died. And as all of you writers know, and a lot of readers, titles change all the time, and the one you choose in the beginning almost never ends up being the one at the end. But that was the placeholder, and that ended up being the eventual title. So
great, thank you. My next question, so I'm going to ask one question of each of the essayists, and then we'll have some general questions that everybody can sort of work on together and have a bit of a dialogue. So the next question is from Mona. And I think you said in your essay that you hadn't read much Thoreau before your climb of Katahdin. And you said you hadn't finished Walden, but sometime after your adventure, you read more Thoreau. And I'm curious, what did you read? But more, how did your climb in Katahdin inform your reading or change your opinion of him?
It's funny, it's funny about reading. I found in my life that you almost have to have the right book at the right moment. Even if you have a great book and it's not really the right moment for you, it won't speak to you. And I was thinking, it's funny, I mean, Katahdin really, that climb, that frustrating climb, really sort of set me back, and I read a lot of Thoreau, but lately I've been reading Thoreau again, I think in terms of the pandemic. And I wonder if I was thinking of what you were saying, Andrew, and it seems so much a pandemic. I guess if there's anything good that will come out of this pandemic, it seems to me that a lot of people have really changed their feelings about work and about what they consider work, what they consider, I don't know, how they live, what they consider work and what they consider not work and what they consider meaningful, and where the meaning lies between the obligatory and perhaps the mindless. And I was just reading today, and I came across in the essay Walking, I came across the line, "I think that I cannot preserve my health and spirits unless I spend 4 hours a day at least, and it is commonly more than that, sauntering through the woods and over the hills and fields, absolutely free from all worldly engagements." And I'm struck again by the radicalism of his proposition for how to live, and how in just this short period, under 2 years, we've all moved quite a bit closer, I think, to his ideals and his way of life, and what he considers valuable, and what he considers leisure, and what he considers work.
Great, thank you. And has your son continued to read Thoreau, or is he done since he's climbed Katahdin?
No, he's definitely a Thoreau reader too.
Oh, good. Glad to hear that. So Zoe, in your essay, you took for the motto of your essay a line from Thoreau's first book, in which he wrote, Nothing was ever so unfamiliar and startling to a man as his own thoughts. And so I was wondering, as you wrote this essay, thinking about Thoreau and his brother John, as well as your own family, what thoughts startled you?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you, Jeff. Well, I think I've always been fascinated by sibling relationships. I'm an only child, and so it's always there's this mystique that that sibling relationships have for me. It seems like it's, you know, one of the most elemental bonds. I think that siblings share more genetic material with each other than they do with their parent. I mean, yeah, they do. So, and I didn't really, growing up as an only child, didn't have a lot of insight into that other than through reading and through family members. And then on top of that, when I was a year old, my mother's brother passed away at 31. And I think he was just 4 years older than Thoreau's brother. I think John was 27. So I was thinking a lot about, when I came to A Week on the Concord Merrimack Rivers, I was thinking about sibling relationships. My dissertation advisor, Branka Arsic, has a whole book about A Week on the Concord Merrimack Rivers. And in this book, she's saying that it's really an elegy for his brother, even if the language isn't as overtly elegiac always as one might assume it would be in someone processing one's mourning. And then also she talks about how Thoreau develops a vitalist philosophy about regeneration and transformation. So it's not totally all about mourning, but she connects those themes. And I found when I was reading A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, going into that with thinking about it as an elegy and thinking about Thoreau's relationship with his brother, that he often, so there's this passage in A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers where he describes a river trip that he took with his brother. I mean, that's the whole book, but he writes that, so the water was really choppy and it was really windy. And his thoughts, he and his brother's thoughts made as sudden bends as the river. And so he relates the two of them and their thoughts, even though he's saying that we can't control our thoughts. And he then links the thoughts to bends in water, currents in water, and also migratory routes. He calls his thoughts and his brother's thoughts winged thoughts, like birds. And so I think what I've been really struck by is the way that Thoreau continually links patterns in the natural world with patterns in human thought. And there's an elemental quality to that outlasts any one life. So even in the face of loss, and for him, in the case of his brother, there's a kind of consoling, he can be consoled, and we as readers can be consoled by these similarities and patterns.
Thank you. Michelle, in writing of Thoreau and the art of science and tracing how Thoreau's more scientific data collection has been used recently to prove global warming, if Thoreau were here today, do you feel like he might be more of a scientist than a naturalist, more studied and less transcendental, or are those distinctions irrelevant?
Well, thanks, Jeff. I like that. I like that question. I think he would probably be very unintimidated by those boundaries. During his lifetime, he trampled over them with abandon. Of course, the division between science and art was not as well established as it is now, but he certainly took himself seriously as a naturalist, as the word was at the time, as a man of science. He took himself seriously as a researcher, as he did as a writer, I would say, especially in the last years of his life when he became very serious about data collection and endeavored to do it in a way that would outlast him and last for generations. So I think today he'd probably disapprove of these boundaries we have attempted to strengthen over the 20th century, and he would be pleased that there is so much understanding now that our problems really do transcend these boundaries, and that there is, in a sense, a return to interdisciplinarity, and that people no longer see art and science or as many people see art and science as exclusive or in somehow in opposition to one another.
So now the questions are for all of you. So I'm hoping you will all answer them and discuss with each other. But the first thing I'm curious about is just when you first discovered Thoreau, because for many of us, we've discovered him at all different periods of our lives, whether it's high school or college or further on as adults. So when did you first discover Thoreau, and how has your take on Thoreau changed since then? Anyone can jump in.
I can speak to that. I think I encountered Walden in high school, and I think as most people who read Walden as an adolescent, I was very taken with the idea of, you know, casting off the phony world and going and living in a cabin. I didn't know that he had someone else do his laundry, but I, you know, romanticized all of it and thought that kind of isolation sounded great. Over the years, I have come to see, and I certainly still see Thoreau as caricatured that way, as sort of this high priest of isolation, of kind of adolescent escape. And I more and more come to see him as a champion of connection, I mean, especially as I've learned more about his scientific research and how well he understood ecology, even though there wasn't a word for it then. His isolation from human beings he wasn't so much choosing to isolate himself from human beings as he was choosing to connect himself with other species. And he was happy to have humans along if they wanted to join him. But what was important to him was finding that connection, and he sought it up until the day of his death.
Anyone else?
So I first discovered Thoreau after high school. In college, I went to a very progressive high school in Berkeley, and so Thoreau was not seen as the most PC person to read. So there was a kind of an appeal because we weren't supposed to read him, or he wasn't on any syllabus or anything like that. So I actually ended up encountering a video. Yale has these courses that professors teach that are then broadcast on YouTube, and so anyone can watch them. And a professor, Amy Hungerford, was talking about in her literature class about how Marilyn Robinson, the writer of Housekeeping, it's a 1980 novel, was really, so Hungerford noted these parallels between this gorgeous novel and Walden. And I did some research into it, and Marilyn Robinson, even though she's very Midwestern based, was just steeped in the Transcendentalists and in Walden in particular. So I kind of came to Thoreau through like a 20th or 21st century transcendentalist. But yeah, I think thinking about how my approach to Thoreau has changed over the years. I think just noting, well, so Michelle in her essay really does the work of saying that with Thoreau, like he's both an ecologist, even though that term wasn't, I guess that was a very new term. But he was also a poet. And so just collecting mere facts without doing the intellectual work and creative work that wasn't sufficient for him. And so I think just for me, thinking about appreciating the way that Thoreau uses this gorgeous language full of analogies and these really ornate metaphors to describe the world and to bring it to life. You know, he describes the pickerel and Walden as jewel-like. And just such a fine, keen eye. But he also, was keeping these. Michelle was writing about seed dispersion, and he kept these records that have informed the way that scientists approach climate change. So to be able to do both, he wasn't one or the other, and I think I've just appreciated that more and more the more I read him.
Mona, Andrew?
No, I appreciated what both of you said, and I love that quality of him. I love the quality of the very accurate record keeping, even when it's even when he's recording, where he stayed overnight and, in the Maine woods when he's going up for an adventure, he'll record exactly where he stayed and what he found in the cot and what the reading material, what the loggers had left and what they had for breakfast but at the same time, he's sort of seeking out a very spiritual experience. I mean, you feel that he's on these expeditions for research and often with other people, whoever will come along, but he's actually hoping for a very one-on-one experience between himself and the sublime. And he usually manages to find it and then describe it in a few gorgeous sentences. And then goes back to, regular life. I think I liked what you said also, Michelle, about someone else doing his laundry. There are these little ironies that are funny for the 21st century reader.
Andrew, how did you first come across Thoreau?
Well, it's funny, the laundry thing seems to come up. I don't know who likes the match, but like when I was trying to sell this book, Thoreau was trending on Twitter. And it was because somebody had just sort of resurfaced this thing. Oh, it wasn't this sort of isolation that it purported to be, as if it was news. And also, Zoe, it's funny you mentioned Marilyn Robinson. Marilyn, if you're out there listening, she was the only one, I think, whom I invited to contribute to this book for all the reasons that you mentioned. And we both went to Brown undergrad. So if there's ever a sequel, Marilyn, if you're out there, I hope you will consider contributing. My introduction was sort of pedestrian or common, I guess, because it was in 7th grade, and it was just Walden. And then I had a 9th grade trip from, I went to a collegiate school in Manhattan, and it was a trip to Boston, and a seed was planted, but nothing happened until I got to college. And then I learned that Walden was 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days out of a life of 44 years. And there was a life before and a life after. And so it took, I don't even know how to do the math, a long time for that post-college moment and revelation to manifest in this book. But that was the sort of the trajectory.
I'm sure we've all done lots of interviews, and I've done lots of interviews where people ask me questions, and there's questions that I never like having. But now that I'm on the other side of the table, I get to do it to you guys. Yeah. So if Thoreau were to walk into the room right now and asked you to accompany him on an excursion, where would you hope that he'd take you? And what would you like to say to him? What would you like to ask him? Gosh.
Okay, so I think that I would really appreciate getting a tour of the Hudson. It's a place I can see it almost from out my window. I'm on a Riverside, in the Riverside area of New York. And I've seen it described, well, painted so gorgeously in these, by the Hudson River School. And I've seen it from a distance and have, been very up close to it. But there's something so mythic about it that I think I'd appreciate Thoreau's really keen eye and his distillations of basically just being able to get even closer to something that kind of has this sublime, as Mona Simpson was saying, the sublime can be, well, literally hard to approach. So I think I would appreciate his guidance.
Anyone else gonna go for a walk with Thoreau?
Gosh, I'm torn. I think I'm torn. I'm torn 3 ways. Part of me would want him to take me somewhere that he knew well during his lifetime. Part of me would want to go with him somewhere that he never got to see during his lifetime. Mm-hmm. And another part would want him to marvel at the changes between his time and ours. And I think he'd be equally, just his powers of observation were so strong, and his, what he took from his observations. I think he'd be equally interesting company on any 3 of those kinds of it. Mm-hmm. excursions. So I don't know, but it would be exciting to take Thoreau on the subway. All these experiences that we think of as everyday, but would be astonishing to him. I would think that might be the most fun.
It's such a provocative question, Jeff, and I hadn't until this moment. I'm not far from Central Park where I am now, and I think that would be my sort of destination with him. Just this sort of paradoxical man-made nature, which New Yorkers treat just as their backyard or ostensible nature, and sort of see what he would make of that. And I think while it's all so theoretical, but like I'd be curious what he would say, what any of you would say, in fact, or sort of, is there anyone in today's culture that is sort of the Thoreau of today, someone who we will be looking back at their work 50, 100, 200 years from now? I hear people, Terry Tempest Williams, the female Thoreau, which I don't think is entirely even fair to her to sort of ghettoize it, or just, but it's such a great question, Jeff. I think I'll be kicking that around the rest of the night.
One thing I think Thoreau would love about today's Central Park are the birders who show up every morning in droves, and not only to see birds, but to gossip with each other about where the birds are, or not tell each other where the birds are. I think he would appreciate both the enthusiasm in the middle of Manhattan for migratory species, but also the community of people that seem so dedicated to that piece of habitat.
And Jeff, you could probably speak better to this than the rest of us. I think as far as like the detail, he had a very bad experience with New York, right? I mean, in some way, he hated it. It was Staten Island, but
he hated it. But he was also very homesick, and he very homesick when he's not in Concord. So that was.
But he'd go to Brooklyn to visit Whitman. Was that the?
Yeah, he visited Whitman, Henry James Sr., all sorts of people, Horace Greeley. So he met a lot of amazing people and saw a lot of amazing things, but overall it was not his happiest experience.
And how long after he left New York did he go to Walden? That's a lacuna for me. Like, do you know what that time?
That would take mathematics, and we don't have an hour or so for me to do the math. So yeah, we're gonna pass on that one.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Mona, is there someplace you'd like to go with Henry?
But speaking of Henry James, I was thinking of Henry James Not Sr. and the way he described I was thinking of his reading tours on the West Coast and how he described California as the better looking side of the country. It would be very fun to see Thoreau there. And I'd also like to revisit some of his ideas about chastity, sensuality, love, virginity, and all that. I wonder, that would be a fun dinner party argument to have. But
that would be an interesting conversation on a walk with Thoreau.
He might run away.
He might. Any other thoughts about that? Like what you might want to say to Thoreau or ask him?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to read, his when he refers to women, it's always a very lofty, airy, ethereal state, and he goes on to sort of he really kind of derides sensuality, at least sexual sensuality, but I think it's even more than that, so it's kind of an interesting thing. You wouldn't expect it, because there is a lot of sensuality in his descriptions of his experiences of nature, so it's an odd conundrum.
Thoreau is not always the most appreciated of writers, as we all experience, I'm sure, and in part because he's often misunderstood, with a lot of myths clouding the true picture of who he was and what he was about. So when you told people that you were writing an essay about Henry David Thoreau for a book about Henry David Thoreau that included 26 other essays about Henry David Thoreau, did you get a reaction like, Thoreau? Really? Why? And if so, how did you respond to that?
It must be the circles I run in because everyone said, "Oh, cool."
Oh, there you go.
Me too.
Or maybe they just weren't expecting me to do. I was in the middle of working on a book on the history of conservation, so hipness was the last thing they expected. But I think there's a lot of Thoreau appreciators out there. There are so many Thoreaus, you know, that question of who's the next Thoreau. I feel like he's atomized and spread through our culture and many others. And there are many, you know, there are many inheritors of what he did. And so I think that there are even though, yeah, he does get dismissed by and misunderstood, I think there are plenty of people out there who relate to at least one part of who he is and what he said.
So before we go to Q&A from the audience, I did have one final question for Andrew, basically, and while hopefully attendees are asking you questions. And that is, as you look at the book, as it's now completed, are there any reflections that are missing? So is there some topic you had hoped that one of the authors might have addressed, but didn't? So is there a, you know, now comes Clear Sailing again, a sequel or whatever? So what was anything missed that you were hoping would be?
Yeah, I mean, it's a paradox, because I think even a well-educated layperson, when they think of Thoreau, they think of Walden. And so sort of part of your question, I didn't write anything for the book, but when I told people I was putting this book together, I got some of those looks and expressions, like sort of really, and sort of between the lines, and sometimes much more transparently, you know, I got a reaction sometimes from prospective publishers and sometimes from other, like that Thoreau is really for older white men from New England. And I don't know who I didn't curate this group, but I'm pleased that the three contributors here are all women. I didn't have anything to do with sort of selecting that. And a lot of the pieces in the book are written by women of all different backgrounds, of all different ages. One of the contributors is Robert Sullivan, who wrote a book of his own called The Thoreau You Don't Know. There's so much, as someone said, beyond the pond. I didn't even know the depth of his feelings for his brother until I really got into this project. And that really resonated strongly, very strongly for me. So I would probably like to have even more about that relationship. I would love to have more about civil disobedience. The fact that he and his brother both proposed to the same woman is touched upon, but if I could have 3 more chapters, I might want one more sort of delving even deeper into that. James Marcus has a piece that sort of is about Thoreau's relationship or relations with Emerson's wife, not relations with the relationship, I should say, sorry. So yeah, it's another terrific question, and I've never been fully satisfied at the end of one of these books that the terrain is all covered, but who knows, maybe there's another one in the works.
I think there's always more to say about Thoreau.
There always is. It's one of the wonderful things about him is that he's so multifaceted and so deep, and I never get tired of reading him over and over and over again, and reading Walden at one point and reading him 5 years later, reading the same book many years later. It just becomes a different book each time. So yeah. And
it was, from what I understand, there are 2 movies, or 1 movie and 1 sort of multi-part TV miniseries coming about Thoreau. So hopefully that will be a jumping off point.
Really?
Yeah.
I cannot wait to see who plays Thoreau.
I know, that's an intriguing thought. Andrew, someone from the audience, Kathy Fedorko, answered your question by saying that Henry was in Staten Island from May 1843 to November 1843. And then he went to Walden on July 4th, 1845. So that would be,
So he didn't go run screaming from New York and head to the
it's almost 2 years.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you, Kathy and Mona.
Can
so
I
then-
ask a question?
Yeah.
Jeff, where would you want Thoreau to take you?
Oops.
Good one, Jeff.
So it's interesting. I get that question from a lot of students, particularly. What would you want to say to Thoreau? Where would you want to go? I don't want to meet him.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, if I could meet Emerson, if Emerson invited me to tea and I could sit down in Emerson's study and chat with him for an hour, I would be in heaven. I love Thoreau almost more than any other writer. I love what he has to say. I particularly love how he has to say it. I'm not sure one-on-one in a personal confrontation, I would enjoy the experience. So I would pass.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would pass on the experience.
Is that just because of the personality you sense through his
Yeah,
writing? He would
through
be
his writings and through
quickly or
things that
not appreciative of your interest.
yeah, and things that other people said about him. I mean, Emerson, Elizabeth Orr, who said, "I love Henry, but I do not like him," really says a lot about what he was like in interpersonal relationships. So I think it would destroy how much I love his writing and him through his writing, and that I don't want to see that destroyed.
Maybe writing a letter would be, an option.
Yeah, there we go.
There, I can see that, and I might make the same choice. I would, however, after reading this anthology, love to go ice skating with Thoreau.
Oh yeah, that would be an experience. So Sarah, I don't know if people have asked any questions, but I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, we have a few in the Q&A box. Just a reminder for folks to enter them in the Q&A box. I do see some in the chat, so I will toggle between the two. Thanks for your questions, Jeff. I'm glad you got to fire those back at some people after years of getting some tricky questions. So I'll just ask the question and then leave it open for anyone who wants to answer. The first question, might the smallness of Thoreau's cabin in Walden offer a way for us to think about the ways we live now during the pandemic, when our worlds, at least for some of us, seem to possess a narrower horizon? How might his writings and his habits of mind and his habits of walking offer models for us now? So a layered question, but maybe any part of that, if anyone wants to answer.
There's a writer who he's a botanist. He wrote a book which I haven't read, but have been wanting to read, called, I think, My Year in Nature, something like that. And he focused every day on like a 1 meter by 1 meter plot of land, and looked really closely at the mini ecosystem and different kinds of life forms that were just living in that year, and chronicled all of the changes that he noticed in this really tiny plot of grass. And so I think that, being confined to a smaller space can really train you to look closely and to look for difference and distinction in patterns that we might take for granted, or if we can really focus on something and watch it, we're inevitably going to notice change. And I think there's mystery in that Thoreau helps me to see. And so I think, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree. I have spent my adult life in rural places and living in very small homes, though I should say not small by New York apartment standards, but always very small by the standards of where I was living. And even though I lived off the grid for 15 years, off the electrical grid, it wasn't until the pandemic that I realized, I thought I was living relatively simply, but I was always leaving that place. I was, even though I spent a lot of time there, I was often on my way somewhere, on my way back. And those first months of the pandemic, when we were truly just home all the time, and our diversions were walking around the neighborhood. I had a similar kind of experience to what Zoe's describing, where you do pay deeper and deeper attention to your surroundings, and it takes time. And it was a kind of attention that I wasn't even aware that I was missing.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it's not only a question of space and a little bit of curtailment of our rampant consumer culture, but also a pace of life that allows for more attention, for more even for the things we do. I mean, I think there's a sort of industrial ambition that pervaded even some of our most pleasurable activities. I mean, I've started teaching less and less and less frantic syllabi, because I would go down the halls and I spent one of my favorite things to teach now is to take a whole quarter or a whole semester and take one great novel and do it really slowly. And so I'll teach Middlemarch for over the course of a term. And a lot of people will teach Middlemarch in 1 or 2 weeks, and then they'll have another novel and another novel and another novel. And basically, what are you doing? You're reading the cliff notes, or even if you manage to read the whole thing, you're just tracing the plot. It's just the one of many strands that can be teased out of it. So it's kind of I think Thoreau would argue for a move, there's the slow cooking movement, but I mean, I think it could go much beyond cooking. It can just sort of be the slow life movement. Let's actually pay attention, and give our whole selves and really be present for what we're doing.
Industrial ambition. I really like that phrase.
And it doesn't belong in the English department.
I mean, I'm tempted to say, I guess it's a fallacy that if you're a writer, that you're always home alone writing and you don't have another job. 90% of the published authors that I know and work with have other jobs, whether it's teaching or on staff at a publication. But I've begun to hear people, and I don't know if 4 of you actually, I've begun to hear people come out of the woodwork a little bit and say, almost with a little bit of guilt, that they've actually found it to be a very productive time, work-wise, writing-wise, and also that they really were, and again, tinged with sort of some contrition or something about sort of confiding this, that their daily routines were actually not disrupted as much as if you might go to an office Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. Not that many people do that anymore, even in normal times. But I mean, you can treat this as a rhetorical question or just sort of a statement, but I'd be curious if anyone had anything to say about that, because it doesn't apply to me, but like it's been conspicuous to me that people have started to feel whatever enough to kind of confess or confide that it really wasn't that disruptive to their daily routines. This wasn't the question that was posed. And also this question of productivity. I was with a writer last night who said, he found that there's a difference between people who were in the middle of projects or were working on projects that had already started, tended to be very productive during this time in finishing or making great progress. People who were casting about and trying to start something were really stymied and hamstrung. You're nodding, so I wonder if there's something to that.
I was in the middle of, I was about 3/4 through with my book project when the pandemic came down, and it was obvious that I needed to push through. I was deadline motivated by that point, but I did find myself extremely distracted by the state of the world, and had a sense of why does this matter? Why does what I'm working on matter? What good is it going to do? And I think if I had been casting around for a project at that point, I would have been stymied for many months. I think now I've I've digested the situation or processed it enough to have a better sense of, okay, here's where my role might be, or a writer's role might be. But especially during those first months, it just seemed like, why does writing matter? What do writers do with this?
Was
Oh
this
yes,
book-
this is what happened.
was the subtitle always Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction?
It was no, it was not. But it was before the pandemic, for sure. Yeah, but it did gain multiple meanings, as has a lot of art, I think, in the wake of the pandemic.
You know, I was in LA for the pandemic where I live, and the amount of wildlife in my little yard was, and I don't know how many people had that experience, but it was extraordinary. So many more birds came, so many even wilder animals, you know, the coyotes, the raccoons, everything returned when no one was driving on the freeways. Kind of wild.
I was fascinated by those stories, by wildlife in cities, and what wildlife did in zoos, or not wildlife, but what zoo animals did in the absence of spectators.
I didn't know what the zoo animals did. What did they do?
They did various things. Some of them seemed to miss humans. You know, just miss, like when I took my daughter back to the Oregon Zoo after many months away, the animal caretakers said, oh, the otters, they love to show off. They were bored. The zebras were just as happy not to have anyone around. They like to hang out with themselves. So it was, yeah, but their behavior did change, just in different ways.
All right, thank you all. I'm just combining a few questions. So if you noticed yours hasn't been answered, it's hopefully because I combined it seamlessly into another. But continuing the conversation on Thoreau being misunderstood, based on your reading of his writing, what perspective or characteristic of his do you think deserves more nuance in our conversations today?
I'll just give a very short answer, and then I would say his sense of humor.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yep.
I think so his humility, which Mona Simpson's essay absolutely encapsulates. I think focusing on the level of language, the way that he uses analogies to capture the world around him, which there's a kind of built-in humility in that, because there's an acknowledgement that something and being like something, you can only get so close to it. And I think that, not to oversimplify Emerson, but there's a sense that I've gotten from reading him that there's more of a sense of wanting to possess or see nature as a symbol of thought. And with Thoreau, it seems like there's a much more, Thoreau locates us and humans in nature. He says that we're nature looking at nature. But then at the same time, there's this acceptance of distance, and not being able to communicate with, I think, the famous loon in Walden, like a quizzical approach that I think can be really just great to keep in mind and relate to.
Great. This question might be more for you, Jeff. Was Thoreau Christian or otherwise religious?
He was very religious, but not in a formalized religious or religion. He was very spiritual, believed in God, believed in a higher law given down from God, but he was also very pantheistic, believed in that all religions around the world were basically saying the same thing about how we should treat other human beings. Not a person who would want to be in a church, but his church was nature. And so every Sunday, while all of his neighbors were in the church worshiping with the minister, he was out worshiping God through his walks in nature.
And the literacy today has so much emphasis on STEM. that's impactful? How do we bring Thoreau to those who study engineering, for instance? I'm an engineer and have played catch up all my life. Might be a tricky question.
Cabin building requires a lot of engineering. But seriously, I would just add to what I was saying earlier that I think Thoreau was to the extent that disciplinary boundaries existed during his time, he was the boundary crosser and sort of a flagrant violator of those kinds of intellectual rules. And I think that there are ways that an engineer with the precision of an engineering mind can appreciate Thoreau's use of language, for instance. Not, they can certainly appreciate his use of data, but also the way in which he took those powers of observation and made art out of them. So I think there are many, no matter what your background is, there are many ways into Thoreau.
And we at the Walden Woods Project often have to mold our walks with certain groups into STEM. And I'll just say that, for the engineering part, we always reference how Thoreau was a surveyor for his one of his many day jobs. So maybe not directly related, but he was the first person to accurately measure the pond. People thought it was bottomless back then. And also, he didn't have any training as a scientist, but just being, a great citizen scientist, asking those questions. In other words, you don't need a degree in something to be able to kind of get that information for yourself. Let's see. So Terry Tempest Williams was mentioned as possibly someone who embodies Thoreau character and writer. Anyone else that anyone can think of that is most similar to Thoreau, contemporary writer?
I can think of I guess he died a few years ago, but I think the poems of William Merwin, great environmentalist and naturalist, and had some of the same spiritual inclinations, I think, also as Thoreau.
What was the last name? I'm sorry.
William S. Merwin.
Oh, of course.
R-W-I-N.
I totally agree, Mona. In fact, just purely coincidentally, the person I mentioned I was having that drink and conversation with last night was Merwin's stepson. And so we were talking about the very thing. And in fact, had we included reprints of previously published Thoreauvian work, his would have been at the top of the list. It ended up being all original pieces, and sadly he had died. But the other names that come up are Barry Lopez and Gary Snyder. And I mean, they're a growing list. As someone said, he's been anatomized and sort of is, hopefully that will continue, but those are some of the names that have come up.
For me, I was thinking Wendell Berry.
I'm sorry.
For me, he's the most Thoreauvian person writing and living a Thoreauvian type of life, of that sincerity and that integrity that Thoreau carries with him.
Sorry. Does he live in, is Wendell Berry? Wendell Berry's living in Kentucky, is that right?
Yeah.
He's wonderful.
Yeah, he is.
Okay, question about the essay collection, about one particular essay, I think. So Zoe noted that a week was an elegy. In her essay, Kristen Case wrote that each observation in the journal was not only a registering of the phenomenon, but also a little elegy. In a relentless testament to a vanished present, his words could not get close enough to recapture. Do the panelists agree with the characterization? Does Thoreau's writing excite us because it comes close to describing inevitable vanished presence?
Not all vanished, but yes. I mean, I think he does do that so well, but I think there's also moments of gratitude and exaltation and appreciation for what still remains. And it is kind of incredible too. I mean, you go to some, many of the places that he describes with such, I mean, in my case, Katahdin, you go to that area, it's not all, it's incredible given the way we live and all, but it is still largely untamed. So there's also that.
I think that there's the vanished, but then there's also just getting closer to apprehending what, the ineffable, which doesn't necessarily need to have been gone in like an environmental sense. But just Thoreau wrote that things need to be a little bit remote to be described. And I think that his reverence for that that space that we need to be able to apprehend something, that mystery, that, well, John Keats called it negative capability, the openness to mystery and doubt and ambiguity is,
Also, Thoreau had such an appreciation for the cycles of the natural world. I mean, 100 years later, Aldo Leopold, who created the profession of wildlife biology, talked about the contributions Thoreau had made to phenology, the study of, seasonal movements of plants and animals. So I think he very well may have been recording a death, but it was also a death on its way to, in many cases, a death on its way to rebirth.
That's lovely.
Okay, I think that's a great place to end. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you, Zoe, Mona, Andrew, Michelle, and Jeff. This was an awesome conversation. For all those watching, listening at home, this is going to be recorded, so we'll put it up on our website. If you have friends that didn't make it tonight, they can check that out in a couple of days. Princeton University Press was kind enough to give us a discount code for the collection. Now Comes Good Sailing. I sent directions on how to apply that discount in the reminder email, but I know a few people registered a little later, so I'm gonna paste in the directions here. But if anyone is confused, just reply to the confirmation email you got for the event, and I'll resend it. And lastly, the Walden Woods Project has been offering our virtual events and in-person events in the past for free. We will continue to do so. If anyone wants or can make a donation to our nonprofit, we would be so grateful. But mostly, thank you for continuing to show up to our events. And hopefully there will be many more in-person and online events in the coming year. So with that, I will post.
Could I just interject one last thing?
Yeah.
I just want to put in a plug, a recommendation for a short film, without which I'm not sure I would have had the impetus to put this book together. And I think it's just called Walden. And you can find it if Jeffrey is in it. And it was, I think Ken Burns executive produced it. And it was done by, I don't know how the pronunciation, it's the Ewers brothers, Jeff, is that right?
Yes.
EWERS, and maybe it's 20 minutes, but it is profoundly moving. And Don Henley is so intense and sincere and compelling at the beginning of the film. I can't recommend that more strongly. So I'd have been remiss if I didn't just.
It is available on the Walden Woods Project website. So if you go to www.walden.org, you can access the film that way.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yep, it's right on our homepage. So just scroll down and it will be there.
Great.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.
So much.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Sure.